So, Aubrey, it's wonderful to see you. I always enjoy our conversations about China and U.S.-China relations, and we talk about some of the issues and topics that the On Global Leadership team thinks about and does work on. This week, of course, is a really important week. We've in the lead up to the Trump-Xi summit, we've been talking a lot about what our expectations for that are, but now it's over, and so we can kind of reflect on what we've seen and think about what it all means. So, were you watching intently as this thing was happening?
I was, and reading the news articles afterwards doesn't seem like much happened. I would like your perspective on it, though. It doesn't seem like there were too many wins for the US, and I think that China, from what I'm reading, just continued to establish itself as a powerful force to be aware of and partner with. And I don't think that the US really showed all that strongly from what I'm reading, but I'm curious what you may have seen in your perspective and what our friends in China are saying.
Well, it's a great observation, and I think we should sort of break it down a little bit for people listening, just to kind of go through each of the key topics that we've discussed that were important before. But just to push back a tiny bit, you said it doesn't seem like much happened, which is true, except that's a big happening because essentially, in my view, China won.
Yeah.
China, they sort of established themselves. I think, everyone was expecting Trump to go to China and have the kind of meeting that he had in 2017, where, you know, billions and billions in tariffs were launched and, real kind of strong showing. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen on any of the topics. If we were thinking, we've talked in previous weeks about looking to a couple of key areas, one, of course, being trade. The second being getting China's help with the Strait of Hormuz and the situation in the Middle East. And the third being the Taiwan issues. Yeah, not much happened, but that's a big happening because China really, it wasn't the same Trump that we've expected or come to know. And there has to be a reason for that because I'm sure he didn't have a major personality change. I don't think that happened. What I do think is people have gotten to him the message that this is a dangerous game we're playing. And China is a major partner here, and they needed to be treated like partners because that's what they want. And so if you're going to go in there and flex your muscles and have a tough set of negotiations on all the topics here, it's going to put those 19 CEOs or corporate leaders in danger in terms of what their economic relationship is with China. And so you're right, not much happened, but that was big because China won, in my opinion. Maybe we shouldn't use words like win and lose, but I think China came out looking strong. And I think that's disconcerting to a lot of people who are watching. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that the difference, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it because, yeah, this is an absolute shift of power. I think perhaps had this meeting occurred when it was supposed to, prior to, well, I guess we had the Iran incident already, but prior to Iran, this may have been a different scenario. But I think, the outcome is that America looks really weak. I feel like we've all, sort of been watching this slow erosion of American power in the world. And some of it's intentional, some of it's unintentional and unintended consequences of our decisions as a country and how we're interacting with the rest of the world. But yeah, like even the wins, China's going to buy soybeans from us. Okay, that's great. They were already buying soybeans from us prior to the tariffs and they were finding other sources. So they're just going back to buying soybeans from the United States, right? So yeah, there's not a lot going on. And I think in terms of Iran, China's not going to support, the US got into this mess. We're going to have to get out of it, I suppose. And I think, the way China is organizing itself with less reliance on global energy, more reliance on internally created renewable energy. Yeah, they don't have to come rescue us. They don't have to come get us out of this quagmire we've gotten ourselves into in this global energy crisis that we've created. Yeah, it feels, I'm not surprised, but it is disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll say something that'll make our audiences very uncomfortable, but I actually am not that disappointed because I think we need to be treating China as a collaborative, cooperative partner, and we haven't been. And I've argued many times to anybody who would listen that it's a mistake. We're married to China, and China controls the fate of a lot of major corporate players like Apple and Tesla, and even to some extent Nvidia. And Nvidia didn't come out of this with a win. And so, you know, I guess I see why you're saying you're disappointed, but I think this shift needed to happen. Like I thought it was really disappointing and misconstrued or ill-conceived when Trump came into power in a second term and in January of 2025 said we're going to have a whole new set of tariffs and we're going to reshape the relationship with China. And I just don't think it was bad politics, because China is the second largest economy in the world and they control the fate of a lot of our major corporations. And if things got really tense, it would be bad for us. And so that Trump came in looking a lot weaker, to me it's a good thing, because it means that we're somehow the message has gotten to him. We need to be respectful and treat this partner as the major trading partner in the major economy that they are. And so, it still would have been nice if we would have had a few wins, especially with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. That's where I'm the most disappointed, is because China could, probably have an influence there, and that just sort of sat on the table. I mean, of course, the other major issue here or play here is the Taiwan case. And I know that people in
Yes.
Taiwan are very disappointed. And so that I should maybe back off a little bit on my encomiums about China, because I think that was a really hard thing for a lot of people. For Lai Ching-te you know, has been vocal about this, of just how disappointed he was about sort of Trump's lack of articulation about, the support and for the arms sales and the support of Taiwan's position. And so we can talk more about that in a second, but so I should moderate a little bit what I said. And it just looks like China came out looking a lot stronger, but it's not helping us with the Middle East. And, and that's our fault. Like we started this situation, but the situation with Taiwan is also a big deal. So, but before we get into the sort of details of of what happened and what didn't happen, I was curious if you had any thoughts or read anything as a China scholar and somebody who studied Chinese language, literature, and history. The meeting, instead of meeting at the Forbidden City, but meeting at the Temple of Heaven, was, I thought, a really interesting thing. I was wondering if that hit you at all in terms of what you were doing and watching as an American consumer of news.
Yeah, I had heard it, just really in passing, and I didn't dive deep into it. So tell me what that means to folks on the ground in China.
So it's an interesting cultural moment. So, this is not the first time an American president has gone to the Temple of Heaven. Apparently Ford went there in 1970s, but it's a very, for a China watcher and scholar and sort of a Chinese historian and someone who studies the culture, it's a symbolic act because, okay, the Forbidden City is, it's sort of it's a government compound. And it's, like it's a place where the Chinese government often has major state to state meetings. And, the last time Trump was there in 2017, he was at the Forbidden City, and that wasn't a big surprise. But the Temple of Heaven is a very symbolic place, because it was built in, I think, if I remember correctly, like 1400s, about 1440. And this was a time when the Chinese was really starting to the Chinese culture was really suffering a bit, because, China likes to think of itself, or back then for sure, but to think of itself as, sort of the longest standing, powerful, economic and politically powerful nation. And we've talked about this before. In 1424, when Emperor Yongle died, the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty, China had been the most powerful economy and the most innovative economy for 2,000 years. And they invented everything that Europe used to kind of take power over the world. They invented the printing press. It wasn't Gutenberg, it was China. They invented the nautical compass. It wasn't European nations, it was China. They invented gunpowder, which became a very sad, dangerous invention, because as Europe colonized the world and unleashed things in China, like the First and Second Opium War, which was, as we discussed, the war between the Dutch East India Trading Company and China over the right to sell drugs in China. I mean, it was a really sort of difficult period, and sort of that's the period that sort of marks the beginning of the fall of the Qing Dynasty. But then they built this place called the Temple of Heaven, which, because the Chinese dynastic emperors were usually called the son of heaven, Tenza. So if you want to just refer to the whoever's the emperor of the Ming dynasty or the Qing dynasty at the time, you call them Tianzi, which means the son of heaven. And so they decided to build this monument that sort of said to the world, we know there are a lot of nations out there and you guys all think you're great, but our nation is the one that's connected to heaven. And so here's the temple of heaven. And this is, so it's, and it's just a sort of symbolic thing about Chinese culture and history, but it's an interesting time to think about, like, okay, and we're going to have a visit with the president of the United States who thinks of himself as the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. And we're going to meet with Chairman Xi in the Temple of Heaven, where this is the place that sort of calls out the notion that China is connected to heaven and is connected to, and so anyway, just as a China scholar who
Yeah.
geeks out over this stuff, I'm like, oh, this is an interesting place to have a meeting. And I bet, most people in America and probably even Donald Trump didn't realize the symbolism of it, but for Chinese people, this was a really interesting moment.
It sounds like a very strong show of confidence and power,
Right.
for those who understand the symbolism, and for those of us just realizing it, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think that's, there's a lot of unspoken, there's something said without saying something there. And
Yeah.
that's amazing. And, as we're talking about, that power move, and then also just, kind of how the meeting went, and it's sort of, there's some sort of like a stalemate or some stability there. I wonder if your clock that's ticking towards China becoming the number one world economy, if you would reset that to a shorter time span. Do you think that this might accelerate China's dominance?
That's a good question. And the short answer is no. I think that the timing we've predicted, which is between 7 and 10 years, is really based on just sort of economic markers of how fast the economy is going to grow. And my guess is that China's economy is growing at about 4.5%. So we're not at double-digit growth rate anymore, but 4.5% for an economy that's as large as China's economy, the second largest economy in the world, is going to continue to take them on an upward trajectory. And the United States economy is not going to grow at that rate. And, our growth rate is slowing and will continue to slow. And so my guess, but your question is it going to happen faster? China's pretty careful in terms of how we've, in the last couple of sessions, been talking about the 5-year plans and the 15th 5-year plan and the ways in which, China does this dance or this balance between projected growth and what we want to do, and then creating incentives for local governments as industrial firms to kind of continue to be creative and develop the economy and hit their numbers. We're not in the space or time where just because of the detente between the United States and China is going to suddenly have its growth rates jump to 8%. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And so, they're pretty careful and pretty realistic. And so my guess is that the projections that they have out there of continued growth rate at 4% are going to continue, but the economy is going to continue to be strong, and it's going to continue to be stronger than the US economy. And so my guess is it doesn't speed it up, but we're going to continue to see China's growth and eventual dominance, and it will be the largest economy in the world. And that's what I think, and the OGL team thinks. And yeah, I think it's a powerful time. So, but China's careful. They're careful with their growth.
Yeah. I did hear something. I wish I could attribute the source, but I was listening to it was something on NPR this weekend, and they were interviewing a man who was selling components at this major kind of hub for just buying anything, cameras, parts of cameras, just anything you could need, you could buy it here at this market. And there's a man who was an individual vendor, worked for himself after working for Foxconn. And he was saying something interesting, that it's harder to find jobs right now in China. And partly it's because a lot of the factories, as we've been talking about, the factories have moved out of China into other countries, to sort of hedge the possibility that, the made in China, the tariffs, everything might be kind of more of a struggle. So, China is opening plants, or Chinese companies are opening plants in other countries, right? And so as a result, this man was saying that there's just fewer jobs available for the young people, which could, harm the Chinese economy. Have you heard anything about that? I'm just curious what our perspective is on that.
Yeah.
I know China has a consumption problem, right? Because you did some writing on that. And if this is the case, then that's just going to further, further deepen the challenge there with consumption.
So Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Aubrey. And let me just break it down in a couple of different tranches. So one of the first things is that, to your point about, and whoever this individual was and what he was talking about, but to the point about Chinese companies going to places like India to develop the manufacturing supply chain there and find, big tranches of cheaper labor, or cheap labor. Yes, that's happening, but that is not something that actually hurts the Chinese economy, because what we're seeing now is a continued development. I mean, you and I have talked many times about how and much I admire the manufacturing supply chain that China has built over the last 45 years. And it's the most sophisticated set of industrial clusters and manufacturing supply chains that make components and modules and final assembly. And we do see companies like Foxconn going to Chennai and their final assembly plant for the iPhones and other Apple products. But the movement that's really we're going to see happen is the one you're talking about, which is that as we see the Belt and Road Initiative continue to grow, we're going to see more and more Chinese suppliers going to places in like India and Southeast Asia and Africa. Now, that doesn't hurt the Chinese economy because these are still Chinese companies. And so they're making their money and profits by diversifying their supply chain and finding other cheap labor around the world and building out the development and ties in China, China's leadership in the BRICS economy. So that it doesn't hurt the economy deeply. But the issue that you raised, that the person you were listening to was raising, there is a very, very concerning phenomenon in China. And there's a whole generation of kids that are called the lying down generation. Tender should die. And what that means is, and this is actually, I think, one of the things, again, I speak highly often of China's economic decisions over time, but this was one that has had consequences. So when China launched the one child policy, the reasoning for it was because we're overpopulated and there are a lot of people in poverty, and we've got to kind of get control of the population. And so as an authoritarian government, we can launch things like the one child policy, and that's all you're allowed to do. But what happened with that generation is, it used to be the case that kids grew up with multiple siblings and large families, and they had to think about, how to work in manufacturing supply chain to take care of their families. But we've seen a real precipitous dip in the overall population, and there's just not enough people to work in the factories. I mean, there's still a significant number of people because they still have something called the floating population, which is about 300 million people. And so it's a group of people that move around China and, will just work in seasonal labor in many different places. And so they're fine in terms of, the sort of labor force. But there is this entire generation of people that are just like, there are no jobs for me anymore. So I'm just going to stay, instead of going to college, I'm just going to stay in my room in my home with my parents. And so there is this interesting tension. And so it's sort of coming together with this issue of Chinese companies going global, and we're starting to see a lot of jobs moving over to places like Vietnam and Southeast Asia and India. And so, yeah, there just are fewer jobs. And so there are these interesting demographic consequences for decisions that have been made over the last several decades. So it's an interesting time.
Oh yeah, that is very interesting. Well, what about Taiwan then? I think that might be a good, just, jumping back to the Trump and Xi meeting. I know that in the US, we have, as we talked about last week, we've got the three branches of government and they don't all always agree. And so, we have Trump going to visit President Xi. The Taiwan issue is very, you know, she was very strong in that, this is not a conversation we're going to have. Taiwan is part of China. And then meanwhile, we have folks who are trying to sell Taiwan arms so they can have independence, right? So what is happening here and what are you thinking? What are you predicting? And should we be concerned or is the line pretty clear?
Well, it's a great question. And, again, this is, if I was feeling happy about just sort of the US looking weak in this meeting and sort of trade relations, recognizing China's power, I maybe overstated my happiness because I'm very concerned about the Taiwan situation. And that was a really significant outcome of this meeting. It was a big surprise. So just to review for our listeners, this has a long history to it, and Taiwan itself has a long history that goes back even, before the U.S. was involved with Taiwan, because, Taiwan was occupied by Japan after the Sino-Japanese War. And then there's this complicated history because after Japan was defeated in World War II. And then you had the communist revolution between the nationalists and the communists. When the nationalists lost, they exited to Taiwan, and they just, set up shop and set up their government on the island of Taiwan. And they were even recognized by the world for a long time because, Taiwan held China's seat on the UN Security Council till about 1972. And so it was a really interesting and sort of tense political situation. But when Deng Xiaoping came to visit Jimmy Carter in 1979, and it was a big important visit, because it was really sort of China coming out of its shell of, the sort of depths of the Cultural Revolution and the difficulties that they were going through. But, Deng Xiaoping, who came to power in about 1978, I think, Mao Zedong died in 1976, and Deng comes to power in 78, and then he gets on a plane, comes to China, comes to the United States in 1979. And, there was an agreement that we're going to be economic partners and we're going to develop together under one condition. And that was called the One China policy. Taiwan is a part of China and it will continue to be a part of China. We can have what's called one country, two systems. That doesn't mean we're going to, go in there and force communism down the trough of the Taiwanese political system. But everybody has to agree that there's one country, two systems. Now, right after that happened, the United States Congress, and this is where your separation of powers illusion is, it's a powerful thing about US democracy. If you have veto proof things that happen through Congress, so that means over 2/3 votes in Congress, the United States government, the president, the executive branch can't just veto it and say, we're not doing that. And they passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which said we're going to support Taiwan politically and militarily. So yes, there's one country, but there are two systems, and we're going to sell arms to Taiwan. So that's when that really began. Now, there was an interesting moment when somebody on Air Force One was pressing President Trump on his sort of, soft peddling of what the issues were. And Trump apparently snapped back at saying, so some deal was done with Ronald Reagan in 1982, and you expect that I can't talk about anything with President Xi because that's, when we're talking about this. And, but it was a very interesting moment because there is a $14 billion thing in Congress that needs to be signed by him, $14 billion in arms to Taiwan. And Trump was non-committal. He said, I don't know. I'm going to have to see. I think it was, if you read again about Lai Ching-te and, other leaders of Taiwan, I think they were very shocked and very disturbed that there was sort of such soft pedaling on this. Now, the one thing, and you and I have talked about this before, but I do believe that we got to be careful here because especially under Xi Jinping, but I think in general for the last 45 years, this has been a non-negotiable issue. The view that, okay, so Taiwan can have a different kind of political system, you can have a democracy, and you can have, your own elections. And we moved from the nationalists to the Democratic Progressive Party, which is much more aggressive on the issue of Taiwan independence. But, in my opinion, this is just me, sort of as a long time observer of this, but also just a reader of the tea leaves in what's going on in China, that under Chairman Xi, this is a non-negotiable issue. And if Taiwan was to declare independence, there would be military action. And then the question would be, how is the U.S. going to respond to that? And then, the other question would be, how do all of those U.S. companies that depend so deeply on China and are married to China, what's going to happen? And so I think that this is dangerous third rail stuff. And so it was disappointing to me that, it was just sort of shoved under the rug and just kind of whiffed off. And then, President Trump, sort of said some things that didn't sound like the strong support that the Taiwanese people wanted to hear or needed to hear. And not that he would have or could have said or should have said, yes, we will go to war to support Taiwan. He doesn't need to be that kind of inflammatory hot button issues, but it seems like there could have been a much more thoughtful approach to talking about our long-term political, economic, and military relations with Taiwan. And let's continue to work. We're all an integrated economy, but let's continue to work together and be cooperative. And that's what I think the Trump administration hasn't been good at. And they certainly weren't good at that in the Strait of Hormuz and the situation in the Middle East. And I think, this was another hot button, difficult issue. And so
Yeah.
I think you're
Yeah.
asking is a tough one.
Yeah. Would you like to talk about the recent article, or I guess the next article that we'll be posting to our website, which is the fifth article of the 15th 5 year plan?
Sure, sure. You know, this is sort of our team's kind of summary of what all these things are about. So in the first four articles, we've kind of taken on the individual topics that are, that the Chinese government has carved out, that are really focused on electric vehicles and new energy and, building of engineering and joint venture universities. I mean, they're all different pieces of the significant things that have come out of this 5 year plan. But our last article is really attempting to take a step back and help people understand, like, um, why is this important? Why are these 5 year plans important, and why do they, have such a big impact on the economy? And what we're trying to do is frame it in a way that links it to a lot of our other work. So it's been timely because OGL has been working together for about the last 6 years. And I've been a China scholar for many years, but this has been a unique team to be a part of for about the last 6 years. And then we write about lots of different things, but then the 15th 5 year plan came out, and we thought it was time to sort of dig deep into what this is about. But now I think what we're trying to do is really link this up for our readers and for the world to deeply understand just how the complexity of China's smart economic development all works together. And so the basic idea is, if you sort of take our notion of, we reject the idea that China is, you know, an authoritarian centrally planned economy that comes out of Beijing. You might have thought of that with the Soviet Empire, and when it was still intact, and when Moscow was just ordering things from Moscow to factories and to cities. And what we've done is we've really tried to take this position that, yeah, there are things like 5 year plans, and the 5 year plans set the tone for what the government wants to focus on and what the key focus areas should be. But, and this is where we always invoke Andy Walter's brilliant article, Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And Walter saw this in the mid 1990s. And so it's really incredible to me that he saw it so clearly. But, when we talk about local governments as industrial firms, this isn't Beijing kind of reaching its hand into every single big and small city and saying, here's what you have to do, and you better beat these numbers. It's basically Beijing setting a tone at the top through the 5 year plans. Here's what the emphasis is going to be for the next 5 years. And all of you local governments are incentivized to meet some numbers, but you need to entrepreneurially figure out how to do this. And so what we're trying to do is really help the world understand this dance where, so China's a government that has 5 year plans that come out of, I mean, it's hard for people in America to imagine that Washington would have 5 year plans that are, ordering Phoenix, Arizona what to do. And we just wouldn't do that. Right. And China's not doing that either. There's no orders of what you're going to do, but there are sort of economic incentives that are tied to the key areas of industry and economic development that Beijing has set forward as priorities. And then the local governments are basically incentivized economically because, here again, you and I've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again. It's an ironic thing because we think about, communist planned economies as places where people don't have a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. But in China, it's very much the opposite, where yes, it's a centrally planned economy and there are 5 year plans that come out of Beijing, but local governments are given tremendous incentives to figure out entrepreneurially what industrial clusters they're going to focus on. How are they going to develop? And it was fun when I was working for Apple because I'd studied this stuff for many years. But with Apple, I suddenly had a job of going out and talking to the mayors of these local industrial clusters and just helping them think through, like, well, what's the next steps for what you want to do on an industrial, and just sort of seeing the ways that they thought economically about, how can we be creative in this? And so what we're just trying to do with this last 15 5 year plan article is kind of tie all of those pieces together and help people understand the complexity of this economy. Thanks for asking. It's a good piece. And I
Yeah.
just have to call out my team in China. Chris Gao and Dashao Chen are just amazing scholars and amazing authors, and I'm so thankful to be working with them. And I'm going to go see them in about 2 weeks, and so I'm looking forward to getting my time in China. As you know, I love studying China and I love studying the Chinese economy, but I fundamentally think of it as a boots on the ground experience. Like, you just can't be a good China scholar if you're just reading state statistical data or state statistical yearbook. You have to go in talk to people, and you have to talk to people in these cities and in these industrial clusters. And so, I teach here in America, and so I don't always have time for that, but 3 or 4 times a year, I try to get over there and hang out with my China team, and we go out and figure out which cities we're going to study and which cities we're going to talk to. So I'll get to see Chris and Dash real soon.
That's awesome. I am so glad you are taking the trip and going to put your own boots on the ground again. I know it's been a couple months since the last time you were there, so I know that you'll make great use of the time, and maybe we can talk about that next week, what your travel plans are,
I love
and
that.
what you hope to gain out of your trip.
I would love that. That'd be awesome. And yeah, at some point we got to get you to China. So
I love that.
let's make plans for that. All right. Well, Aubrey, thank you so much for just another wonderful conversation. And these are tense times, and we've been spending several weeks leading up to what's going to happen with this meeting. And now we've seen the meeting, and we've hopefully given our listeners a little bit of a helpful debrief on what happened.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be looking more for I didn't see a lot in the news about, it was mostly the headlines about what the CEOs that traveled to China, kind of like what they were saying, so I'm gonna spend the next week just looking to see what, if anything, I can glean from their perspective, so that's something I'll be looking at this week, and, yeah, looking forward to learning more and talking again.
Well, I look forward to talking about that when we talk next week. But I mean, again, I think people were maybe disappointed, but it was just a little bit quiet. I mean, if you read the news, Boeing, didn't get the deal that they wanted when in 2017 there was a commitment to buy 400 planes, and this time it was just 200 planes. And Tim Cook was pretty quiet because Apple is at such a vulnerable position with respect to how dependent on China it is. And Elon Musk, I guess, was quiet, and then Jensen Huang, Nvidia, didn't get anything advanced in his case. So there is an interesting sort of balance of like, okay, so we showed up with all of these powerful people, and to our earlier part of the conversation, what really happened? Well, not much. And I love how we started that conversation, because not much, it might mean just not much, or it might mean that China won. And so it's an interesting time. So anyway,
Yeah,
I'll,
yeah.
I'll look forward to continue our conversation next week, and I'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Bye.
Bye.